Honorable Grain Malunga, other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure for me to be here to talk about energy and energy in Africa. I always remember the specification that was done, something that was done by Prime Minister Odinga of Kenya, when he said, everybody knows Africa as the dark continent. And when it is said like that, many people believe that it is because there are black people in Africa. But when you fly at night, you can see many of the other places. You can see Europe, you can see Asia, but you can't see Africa. And that's why it's a dark continent. There is no energy. And essentially, from the topic given of integration of the various energy options onto the grid, how do we electrify Africa, basically? There have been very traditional sources looking at what has been used in many of the countries, and most of it has been coal. Coal has been, and still remains, the major source. With its complications, with its technology, there are challenges about environmental friendliness of coal. We are now looking at coal-friendly technologies, where we are now calling them clean coal technologies. But these have not yet taken root. But the world over, coal remains one of the largest source of energy. And China, who are developing rapidly, including India, they are relying a lot more on coal. And therefore, I think it will be foolhardy for Africa to start thinking that we cannot rely on coal. So we have to be very clear that if we are going to energize this country, our continent, then coal will remain one of the major sources. And we have got to find ways that are environmentally friendly, but certainly not discard that option. If we do that, we will never be able to develop, because energy is what really shows whether you are developed or not. And if we are talking about development of our countries and of our continent, then we have got to think seriously about provision of energy to our continent. I think the next one is hydro. Hydropower is important, and we have in Africa perhaps a few large dams that generate enough power for us, and most of these have been national. We have got large dams, we have got small dams. Now we are talking of the small hydros and micro hydros. Whereas the small and the micro are important at a local level, in terms of greater national impact, they continue to play second fiddle. But there is also something that's important that we have not done in Africa. This is massive runoff river generation. So instead of having one large dam, you can have several stations that will be able to generate perhaps more than what one large dam can do. It has got an advantage of really being able to be cost effectiveness. It can be put up quickly, and in most of the perennial rivers, the difference between when there is too much, when the flow is high and when the flow is low, is not that big. Yes, it is there, that's one of the disadvantages, but certainly when you have got a series of these, you will be able to get a lot more electricity out of the rivers And beyond that, you can also still dam them. The issue that we find in Africa in particular and in our own countries is to understand our own demand forecast and the demand curve of electricity. Many people just think that electricity can be stored. Yes, with sun you can, but to a large extent, you have got to generate exactly the same as you are consuming. And that demand curve, the management of it can actually assist us as a way of dealing with our shortfalls currently. Because every country, even if you take South Africa, that meets its peak demand, means it has got excess capacity off-peak. And that excess capacity is lying idle, can either be shared or be kept. And this has been one way that I have not seen much debate on. How do we share off-peak electricity? Because many of the countries, and I can talk of my own country, where we have got massive load shedding because we barely have got enough, we can actually benefit from countries that meet their peak, because peak generation perhaps lasts for 3 hours, 4 hours at the most, and therefore for 20 hours they will have surplus generation capacity. We'll talk about it a little later. But one that is grossly misused by the world is really our demand forecast. What is our future demand for power? Invariably, when you look at anything that goes into 3 figures of a plant, there will be many questions from financiers and international bankers as to what are you going to do with that power? Is that project not too big? And essentially, that has stinted the development of power in Africa. Because anything, and the previous speaker was talking of the Great Inga. The Great Inga has failed to take off, largely because everybody says there's too much power. What are you going to do with it? And I think it's a mindset thing, and it's something that we have got to grapple with ourselves. The other source of power that is we can tap into is solar. The solar technology has come a long way. I know in some countries they are already using it, but mostly on a standalone basis, with very few plants that feed into the grid. The technology that is available right now makes the storage of solar power very expensive. And when you look at the tariff structures of many of the countries, they cannot take solar tariffs and costs. And the reason of that is partly the technology, but also partly a mindset. Solar costs are always upfront. You put everything upfront. You have got very little maintenance thereafter. But the time of life, or average lifespan, depends on what you are going to amortize over the years. If you take a 10-year horizon, a 15-year horizon, a 20-year horizon, or a 25-year horizon, it gives you very different tariff structures. And depending on how quickly, and most people are very quick to want their return on their investment, they have got much shorter time horizons. And that's why the big plans are not being put into Africa. And that's why solar, for now, remains a great hope, but very little in terms of implementation. I know South Africa is doing a little bit more, but I think beyond that, there is very little that is being done. There are people who have come to Zimbabwe looking at solar options. They talk a lot about it, but actually to generate sufficient power to put into the grid has remained a challenge. But there's also a way one can exploit solar without necessarily the extra costs, is to be brave enough to say we are going to use solar only for daytime electricity. Because then that way the cost actually comes down very drastically. Which means that as the sun comes up, you use it, and as it goes down, you lose it. I've not seen many investors wanting that, but certainly I think that as governments, as we move forward, it's an option we will have to look at as a part of an energy mix with other sources. The second one, on the last thing on solar that I can think of is for use for irrigation. Standalone irrigation, because our countries are ravaged by droughts, and we have got many rivers, particularly in summer, that flow by. We need to be able to think how we can use the solar and solar pumps to irrigate our farmlands, to be able to get food self-sufficiency without necessarily incurring the huge costs of storage of that power. So the sun comes in summer, it's quite intense, and when there is a drought, it's even more intense. And therefore, you'll be able to recover that way. The next source that is being investigated, and we need to investigate a lot more, is biogas. Biogas can be clean, is renewable, and many of the towns, and as more urbanization takes place, there is a problem of what to do with the sewer. And sewer becomes one of the major sources of biogas. I know a few countries are trying it, but there is very serious lack of mindset shift to be able to use the biogas, the sewer in particular, for electricity generation. In many towns, it's a problem. Sewer is a problem. And sometimes that gas has got to be flared, sometimes it's just let into the atmosphere without it being used. We also have got landfills where we can get biogas from. Again, these sources remain idle whilst we look for fancy sources elsewhere. And I think that the closer we look, the better. We can also look at biogas as a source for heating. So instead of actually electricity generation, we can pipe the gas into the homes, into the institutions, for heating and cooking. And the good thing about biogas is we can also take it to the village, lighten the burden of the women of Africa. Because the most overburdened beast on earth is the African woman. And when we have provided biogas and biogas technology, and these are there, the heating and the cooking, you take that off from the grid, you increase the grid to do something else. And therefore, you don't necessarily have to put everything onto the grid for it to be useful, but you can substitute by doing what you do with the electricity on the grid, with your biogas and natural gas, you will be able to get more electricity to do some of the things. Gas in Africa is increasingly becoming important. There are discoveries of natural gas in Mozambique, Angola. They are already exploiting it. In Zimbabwe, we have got methane, coal-bed methane. And there is need to exploit these so that you can use them for electricity generation for you to put it on the grid. But again, you can also pipe it straight into the homes and release the pressure. Wind is another source that is coming up. Again, like the sun, you know, sometimes there is wind, sometimes there isn't. I was listening to some German presenter telling me that the wind variability and is quite high. So you have got high wind, you generate more. You have got less wind, you generate less. And requiring the balance of power, it means that you cannot have and rely on wind alone. You will have to have another source that balances, that when the wind falls, what do you have to put up so that you balance the power? And when the wind picks up, what do you have to step down? So wind and solar, you can see, can be used effectively in combination with something else, whether it be gas, hydro, and other future technologies that will come on. Nuclear. There's been some discussion about nuclear. Clearly, there are dangers regarding nuclear, but it still remains a source, and we have to explore that source, improve its safety, because if we are going to have sufficient power for our continent, we might find that nuclear is completely unavoidable. And the choice will be, even with the dangers that it has, are you likely to, should you have power or should you remain backward? And that is a tough choice, and we need research and nanotechnologies to come through to assist us. But it will be quite foolhardy for us to simply say we will never do nuclear, because it's almost declaring we don't want to develop. And I don't think that the equation is that simple. We have to be serious about it, and the development is our job. And electricity, you can do anything else. If you were to see how much electricity is consumed in any country, you can almost directly link it to its GDP and its growth, not its population. Last year I visited Norway, and I found, to my horror, that those people are less than 6 million people, inhabitants. But when you look at their generation capacity, they've got 28,000 megawatts. Take South Africa out of it, you could probably fit the whole of SADC into that megawatt generation. And that's the mindset that we have got to look at. If we have got to develop, we need more power. And the sources of power, clearly, when you put all the coal plants that you might want, the current rivers that we have got, we will not be producing too much. And therefore, the option of nuclear at some stage, Mr. Chairman, has got to be considered. The one thing that we have done well regionally has been to integrate the transmission. And therefore, you actually have got the Central African Power Pool, the Southern African Power Pool, you have got the Eastern Africa Power Pool, and you're trying to have a Western African Power Pool to link the two. And I know there are plans now to link Eastern African Power Pool and Southern African Power Pool, or relying on also the power that will come and be generated from Somalia, no, from Ethiopia, sorry. We, as national governments, have been good at putting in the transmission and sharing that infrastructure. But I must admit that we have been extremely poor in thinking regional generation. We have been very poor at it, and our mindset has got to change so that we begin to see that the future of generation is something that will have to be done regionally. And that when we look at the Great Inga, we should not be worrying about the 40,000 megawatts that they can produce, but that the potential of 100,000 megawatts is what we want to see now. And if we were to develop that together, not only do we have a very cost-effective source of power, a renewable source of power, we actually will be unlocking the development of Africa. Because with that power, we will be able to do everything. When the rest of the world looks and say, where are the next factory is going to be? It will then have to be Africa. The resources that Africa has got, very few countries have got that much. There was one professor who tried to fit in the world into Africa. And you could see that you can put India, China, Europe, and still have spare in terms of landmass of Africa. And therefore, the natural riches that are in Africa, if we are going to do something about it ourselves, we need to start by providing energy for it. Because otherwise, the extractions of our mineral resources will continue. And the value addition will only be done in faraway countries because we lack power. And therefore, this thing of thinking regional is important. And I think that we have got the means to do it. It is within our means. But the mindset I have seen so far in my short 2 years in energy have shown me that the thinking could be actually the opposite. And I think that with a large user like ESCOM, that leadership role, if I might say it publicly, needs to be improved. Leadership in Africa in energy development needs to be improved. And I take the responsibility as well as a minister, because as a minister of energy, I cannot absolve myself from it. We have got to develop the Great Inga together, because it is a renewable source, it is cost effective, and that energy is required if we are going to develop these countries as rapidly as possible. I come back to Zimbabwe. I would like to say that Zimbabwe and the way it is perceived could not be far from the truth. And many people look and listen to journalists who don't have the information, but create a perception. I just want to give you some hints here. When you look at the energy legal framework of Zimbabwe, it is the best in Africa. I can say so very clearly. It allows government to play a role. It allows the private sector to play a role. We are one of the few countries that will have independent power producers selling directly to independent power consumers, and the regulator only dealing with how much wheeling charge will be paid for that transmission. You don't see it anywhere else. We now have put in place an independent regulator who can issue licenses, determine the tariffs, and regulate that industry. Yes, they are not yet a year old, but they are already being felt. We have got a policy of cost recovery. And therefore, those who consume electricity will pay for the full cost of it. And the good thing was, because the government was broke and nobody could talk of subsidies, it was important to put this. And many countries are still struggling with the cost recovery. We are already there. We have recently agreed with our neighbors, Zambia, to put up the Batoka hydro power scheme, which will generate anything between 1,600 to 2,000 megawatts. Again, it looks too big, but when you look at the future requirements of power, that is nothing. And this can be done on an independent power producer framework. Thank you. And therefore, with the Zambezi River Authority looking at it, there are opportunities there. We are already have adopted the issue of going smart meters. So we are going to be putting smart meters in our country as soon as this year, together with prepayments, so that whatever electricity is consumed would have been paid for. And finally, Mr. Chairman, in terms of extending the grid to the rural areas, this project is now running very fast. And we believe that over the next 5 years, over 80% of our rural schools, clinics, and public institutions would have been connected to the grid. I thank you.